We're beginning a new series called The Comparison Trap. Now, you may have heard this before because there are some other churches that have covered this same concept. Now, what we're going to talk about might be a little bit different, but it's along the same lines. And so the reason why we're doing this is because it's really valuable. I think it's something that we face a lot. And to kind of set it up, I want to give you an example of me comparing myself against another person. So I was in 8th grade. Every story that begins that way is going to be awful, you know. I was in 8th grade and I was in computer class. This was back when you had to learn typing in school. I guess now kids maybe know it by the time they get to school, but at that point we had to learn it. So we were sitting in computer class and you would sit sort of adjacent to some other kids. And so there was a girl there that was known, that had a reputation in our school for not being wealthy. Let's put it that way. She came from a pretty low income kind of situation, and she got kind of made fun of it pretty often. And one day, I was sitting next to my buddy. I believe his name was Zach. I was sitting next to Zach, and this girl was across from us, and she picked up her bag and put it on the table, and a roach crawled out. Now Zach saw it. I didn't see it at first. Zach saw it and he goes, "Oh, look at that. And he began to make fun of her. And I don't remember exactly what my involvement was, but I do remember thinking that I'm better than that. That was kind of my perception. Now, I don't think I said anything. I wasn't the type to verbally make fun of people. That wasn't my gig. But I remember thinking that, oh yeah, I'm better than that. And that story got spread by Zach through a sort of our friend circle. And it was really sad because here we were kind of comparing ourselves against this girl, and this was something that she didn't have any control over. It wasn't her fault. It's just something that happened. Now, here's why I tell you that, because it's something that happened to me later. I was in college at this point. I was, I think, a freshman in college, and I was driving, of course, and my dad, I was still living at home, and my dad asked me to go pick up something at the pharmacy. And so I said, no problem, I'll hop in the car and go and get it. So as I was going, I just picked up a ball cap that was sitting on a pile of laundry. I always had a pile of laundry in my room that I just never could keep up because we were doing our own laundry at the time. So I picked up a ball cap, just put it on, went to the pharmacy. So there I am standing in line at the pharmacy. Something started itching my head. It's like, oh man, what is that? That's weird. And just kind of kept doing that. And there's people behind me, there's people in front of me. I mean, I'm like surrounded, I kept doing this. Like, something is going on up there. So I take my hat off, and a roach falls out of my hat onto the floor. And there's this like moment of like, what do I do? Do I pretend like that didn't happen? Because the guy behind me definitely saw it. A roach just fell out of that dude's hat. And so I stared at it on the floor thinking, I probably should crunch it, but if I make a move, they're going to know that I had something to do with that. So I let it go. And shortly thereafter, that CVS shut down health code. I don't know. It was weird, unrelated. No, that part didn't happen. I don't know. That roach probably went off and lived a wonderful life in CVS. But here's why I tell you that. Because it was a moment, and it didn't occur to me immediately. It took me a little while. But I thought back to that 8th grade year. I thought back to that moment where we saw that roach crawl out of that girl's bag, and I thought, oh my goodness, that just happened to me. And way worse, it crawled out of my hat. I mean, it crawled out of my clothing. I mean, how awful is that? And what it reminded me of is how dangerous, how much of a trap it is to compare ourselves, especially when we don't know the story of the person. We don't know what's going on, and so we have to be really careful. This is a real trap. So I've got there up on the screen the comparison trap, and below it, a trap. I don't know what this would catch, but small rabbit. But I want you to kind of imagine this as what happens when we compare ourselves, when we begin to think about ourselves compared to others. Now, we had a discussion online about this, and by the way, if you're not connected to our Facebook page, if you're on Facebook, get connected with our page, because I'm going to try to start having discussions online about our sermon series that we're in. And so we were having a discussion about this kind of leading up to Sunday, and somebody said, sometimes it can be good to compare yourself against other people. And I totally agree, because sometimes when we compare ourselves, we learn that there's some things we need to fix. And that can be a good thing. But what we're going to be talking about today is the negative aspects of going too far, of comparing ourselves in a way that has two really bad outcomes. Now, here's what I want to kind of set up for us so that we can kind of see that this is not just something that I struggle with, but it's something that we really all struggle with. And to set that up, I want to talk about the land of Ur. Have you ever heard of the land of Ur? You're thinking, was that where Abraham was? No, that was Ur of the Chaldees. That's something else. This is the land of Ur. And in the land of Ur, we all want more Ur than everybody else. I want more Ur than you. You want more Ur than me. You say, well, what is Ur? Well, here's what Ur is. Richer, skinnier, smarter, taller, prettier, happier, healthier, talented-er, good-er, better. I don't know. Those last few don't quite work, but you get the idea. We're all looking for a little bit more. We're looking for sort of a leg up. We're trying to be a little bit better than those that were around. And there's basically two sort of situations that we get into when we compare. We're going to talk about those. But I just want to kind of think through this with you. So when I was in school, like I told you, I made a habit of comparing myself against other people. There were popular kids in the school, and I hated them. Why? Because they intimidated me. So I compared myself against them, and I said, oh, they're just meatheads. They don't know anything. They can't read a book. So I found reasons to think of why they were bad, because they intimidated me, and I compared myself, and I found a way to be superior, at least in my own mind. Of course, they could run the football twice as fast as me, but I didn't care. I was somehow better than them. I found a way to compare myself. As I grew up, I did the same thing in college. I found a reason why the kids with 4.0s were not as good as me. There's some reason why I'm better, and you got to be pretty savvy to figure it out, but there's some reason why I'm better than those kids that are ace in their classes. And then once I was in sort of the dating circle, same sort of thing. My girlfriend's prettier than your girlfriend, or my wife's prettier than your wife. This happens all through life. And then once we had kids, oh my goodness, kids. We compare our kids against other people's kids. Why are my kids so much worse than your kids, or so much better than your kids? I wish we could trade kids. I mean, whatever it is, we compare, and we're always looking for more. We're trying to figure out how we're better, smarter, whatever it is. So this has some really difficult consequences. And our bottom line today is this: there's no win in comparison. There's no win. I mean, there's nothing to be gained when we compare in this way. When we compare like this, there's just nothing to be gained, but there are quite a few things that are going to harm us. And that's kind of what we're going to dig into. Now, Paul had a really interesting statement in 2 Corinthians. He said this: they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Now, if you take out what's between the commas, what he's basically saying is he's talking about a certain group, they are not wise. And so who is it that is not wise? Well, he explains it's those who measure themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves. So basically, when we compare ourselves against each other, we're not wise. That's what he's saying, is that if you want wisdom, wisdom is that moment when you begin to move away from comparing yourself against other people. Now, this is so innate, so natural, that often we don't even think about the fact that we're doing it. We don't even think about the fact that it's happening. So, we're not wise when we do it. Now, we're going to look at Jesus' parable. You've probably heard this one before, but we're going to kind of look at it from a different angle. This appears in Luke 18, but it's going to be up on the screen, so if you want to follow along up there or look in your Bible, either way is okay. So here's what Jesus is saying. Now, what he's going to do first is he's going to set up for us who he's talking to. So the thing about parables is parables always have basically one lesson. Now, some preachers will get like 15 lessons out of a parable, and I think that's a little dangerous, because when Jesus gave a parable, he had one main bottom idea. And we always got to ask, what is he trying to teach? And so if a parable is teaching this one thing, we got to be careful about going beyond in a parable what he's teaching. So notice what he says to kind of tell us what he's talking about. He says, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. So the first thing that we see here is he's talking to a group of people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. So ultimately what we're seeing here is this is a group of people that believed they were good enough to please God. They were good enough, they thought, to get into heaven. Whatever the blank is there, they could fill it with their own righteousness. Those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. But here's the unintended consequence of trusting in your own righteousness. What is it? It's in yellow there. And they despised others. Now, I've seen this all through my life, that those that get into the mindset that we can be good enough for God to love us, good enough for God to save us, good enough to get us into heaven, the unintended consequence is that when we do that, we begin to despise other people. Because what we do is we say, I'm righteous enough, why can't you be righteous enough? Or why can't you be righteous enough? And we begin to despise those that can't do it. And so this is an unintended consequence of believing that we're righteous. Now let's see what Jesus' lesson is here as he moves forward. So he says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. Now in the temple there was daily prayer time where people would come, all kinds of people from all over Judea would come into the temple and they would have prayer time. Now he says one was a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now, I feel like I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't explain a little bit about these two. We're going to call them men. We're going to assume they're men. These 2 men. First of all, the Pharisees were incredibly religious. They were extremely legalistic, but they were so religious. And if somebody is going to find their way into heaven by doing good works, it's going to be a Pharisee. I mean, the Pharisees, by the time they were 13 or 14 years old, if they were going to make it as a Pharisee, they had to have the Scriptures memorized. I mean, you know that big fat part of the back of your Bible called the Old Testament? That's what I'm talking about. They had to have that memorized by the time they could move on into being a disciple of an official rabbi. And then after that, they would have to also memorize the commentaries that had to do with the Old Testament. I mean, these guys were sharp. Not only would they have to do that, but they had to keep the law. I mean, their premise was that we can keep the law by doing good. And that was how they were trying to get their way into salvation. So that's the Pharisees. And here's the thing. We think of the Pharisees nowadays as the bad guys because they were always opposing Jesus. That's not necessarily the view of the people who Jesus was talking to. See, Jesus had not let the people in yet. I mean, he was beginning to, but people did not really know yet that the Pharisees are kind of the bad guys. We know that, but they don't know that. So what Jesus is about to do is going to be pretty surprising. Now, the second person in the sentence is tax collector. And I have a particular way for explaining what a tax collector, what it would be sort of in a modern equivalent, and it's a little bit offensive, so I'm just going to let you know. Here's what a tax collector would be like. Let me just kind of paint this picture. Let's imagine that in one of America's great wars, we lost. Now, we've done pretty well in wars, obviously, but let's say that we lost. And whether it's the Nazis or I don't know, Vietnam or whatever, we totally lost, and then we became occupied by our enemy. Let's make it the Nazis, because there's been some time passed since then. So let's say that the Nazis won World War II, and then they occupied the United States and the rest of the world. They're a world power in this imagination, in this hypothetical situation. Now, imagine that the Nazis begin to gather taxes. They require that we pay taxes as their, because they occupy us. Now imagine this. Your next door neighbor collects taxes for the Nazis. They collect taxes, and not only do they collect taxes from you, but they keep a little bit for themselves. And sometimes they keep a lot for themselves. You know that they're doing it. They know that they're doing it. The Nazis know that they're doing it. They are collecting money for the enemy and for themselves, and they're taking it out of your pocket. And by the way, it's really hard to feed your family because the economy has collapsed. I mean, this is a difficult situation. That's a tax collector. That's the kind of situation that they lived in, except that it's not the Nazis for them, it's Rome. Rome was their incredible enemy. And the neighbors of these people would be collecting taxes. I mean, these guys were hated. And you know what the Pharisees would say about the tax collectors? They say, oh, they're going to hell. I mean, it's not even a joke. They're going to hell. They just are. That's what the Pharisees thought. Because they're sinners. They're in this class of sinners. They're going to hell because they have abandoned and even betrayed their countrymen. That's just the way that the Pharisees would have seen it. And so In this story, Jesus sets this up, and what the people are thinking is, okay, good guy, bad guy. Good guy is the Pharisee, bad guy is the tax collector, but Jesus is particularly good at what we call the Gothic swap, where by the end of it you realize the guy you thought was the good guy, he ain't the good guy. And the guy you thought was the bad guy, he's not the bad guy. See how that plays out. So here's kind of an artist's rendition, kind of an idea of what this might have looked like. And we're going to return to this. So obviously you see, let me see if my laser's working. You see the Pharisee over here, and you see the tax collector over here. So the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. I think the phrase, he prayed with himself, is really interesting. It doesn't say that he prayed to God, although the Pharisee seemed to think he was praying to God. I just think that's an interesting phrase. He prayed thus with himself. And so what it seems like it's getting at, he's praying about himself. He's just kind of tooting his own horn. He's just sort of praising his own deeds. Let's see what kind of things he says. So this is the Pharisee praying. He says, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. Now, can you imagine like having a church prayer time and somebody doing this? Whoa, I mean, this guy is tough. So the tax collector's sitting right here, apparently not too far off, or a little ways off, but probably close enough to hear. And he hears this Pharisee praying, thank you, Lord, I'm at least not like that guy. What is the Pharisee doing? He's comparing. I mean, this is the essence of the comparison trap. He's comparing himself against the tax collector. In fact, he goes on. He says, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Interesting thing about this is the Pharisee seems to think that God needs to be reminded of his good deeds. Really interesting that that's what he spends his time doing. He's not asking God for anything. He's not telling God anything God doesn't know. He just feels the need to verbally and probably out loud say these things. Seems like maybe he's trying to let others know as well. So, once again, this is what we're looking at. The Pharisee, full of pride, comparing himself against this tax collector. Now let's see what it says about the tax collector. It's pretty different here. And the tax collector, remember, this is the bad guy, or supposedly, for the people that are here, and this would be the bad guy. The tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I mean, this guy's different. He doesn't even compare himself against the Pharisee. Notice that the tax collector doesn't say, oh, Lord, I wish I could be like the Pharisee. He doesn't do it. It makes me think of this phrase I heard years ago, that humility is not thinking lowly of ourselves. It's just not thinking of ourselves at all. And it kind of seems like that's what he's doing here. He's not comparing himself against the Pharisee. The Pharisee was doing that, but he's not comparing himself against the Pharisee. It seems that he's comparing himself against what God expects, which is much more healthy. And so he's humble, he's contrite, he's asking God for mercy, and apparently somewhere in here he becomes a believer as well. We know that in Scripture that those who are justified, those that become believers who have faith in the Messiah, in the Christ, they are justified. It's interesting that the next line says, I tell you, this man, he's talking about the tax collector, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. So it's the tax collector who's humble, who cries out to God, who also believes that he can be forgiven apart from his works. I mean, we can't miss that. This tax collector believes that God can forgive him. He's crying out for mercy. He believes that God can forgive him apart from his works. Now the Pharisee sees himself as good already, and therefore the Pharisee doesn't think he needs any help in being saved. We have a really different situation here. Now, I think one of the things that I want to bring up is that for the tax collector, he does not compare himself against the Pharisee, but the Pharisee has chosen pretty selectively who he compares himself against. I mean, think about this for a second. Can you find someone that does a better job than you? Absolutely. Can you find someone that's more righteous than you? Of course you can. I would even say, could that Pharisee find another Pharisee that was more righteous than him? Yeah, he could, but he chose not to. What did he do? He compared himself against someone that he deemed lower. That's what we do conveniently most of the time when we compare. We choose selectively who to compare ourselves against. And here, he chose someone that's in the gutter, that is living, potentially just living in sin. And he chose that person because it made it easier on himself to see himself as righteous. And here's one of the big problems with comparison, is that we get a skewed view of ourselves when we compare against others because it's us choosing who to compare against. Let's see what Jesus says after that. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now this is Jesus' bottom line, right? This is the lesson of the parable. So we don't want to go beyond this lesson and say it could mean these other things. This is what Jesus is getting at. That when we approach prayer or the Christian life with pride, trying to exalt ourselves, because that's what the Pharisee was doing. He's trying to let everybody hear about all his good works. When we do that, we're going to be humbled, and that's probably going to hurt. But if we approach God with humility, and I'll add to that and say that humility has to do when we don't compare ourselves against others, but we go to God to find out what He thinks of us. It's a different situation. Notice what Paul said to kind of bring this home for us. He says, through the grace given to me, I say everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think. It kind of leaves a question, well, how highly should I think of myself? How about none at all? But we should not be thinking more highly than we ought. We should be careful about this. James says it in a really interesting way. He says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now I have to reiterate here that when he says that God resists the proud, this doesn't mean God's going to deny salvation to those that have a pride problem. I have a pride problem. I mean, you heard it a minute ago. I have a pride problem. This does not mean that God's going to resist in a salvation sense those that have a pride problem, but resist could mean a range of things, but the way I take it is He's not going to bless what you're doing if you're doing it for the purpose of pride. If you're pursuing pride, then He is going to not bless what you're doing. But if you do it in humility, He will bless you. I have a great example of this in action. It's my father-in-law. My father-in-law, he'd be embarrassed for me to say this, but he's a very humble man. And he has got what I would call the golden touch. It seems like anything in ministry that he tries, it just seems to succeed. And I think it has a lot to do with this, that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. It's an amazing idea. It helps us kind of see where some of the traps and pitfalls of comparison are. So, I'll come back to this idea. There's no win in comparison. There's nothing to be gained, but there's a lot to be lost when we compare against others. Now, in this story, what we're seeing here is we're seeing the Pharisee comparing against someone who he thinks of as lower. But that's not the only kind of comparison that we do, right? There's a whole other brand of comparison. It's when we compare ourselves against someone that seems higher than us, someone that might be in a superior situation or superior wealth or superior even righteousness. And so that is a whole nother branch. And what I want to do is I want to jump into that as we think about how this also affects us in this comparison trap. So you'll recognize this photo of King Saul and the young boy David. Now you know this story, but you may not know what comes after this story. So let me just kind of set this story up so that we know, so that we kind of have a foundation for where it's going to go. So King Saul and David. So one day the Philistine army was arrayed on one side of the battlefield, and the army of the Israelites was arrayed on the other side. And nobody's really wanting to fight at this point for some reason. They're kind of standing off, saying, I'd rather not get stabbed today or whatever. And so the Philistines send out this massive man. The Bible tells us 9.5 feet. That's a big guy. I mean, he's imposing, he's intimidating, he's scary. He comes out and he begins to taunt, to make fun of the Israelite army. Now, you know this story, right? He's there and he's calling out and saying, why do our armies need to fight? How about just send one guy out, and whoever wins that one-on-one match, that'll be the winner for today. Imagine if like basketball worked that way. Let's forget the team, just send out... See, I just revealed I don't know a current player in the NBA. Give me a player. Who's somebody that's popular? LeBron James. Send LeBron James out and somebody else. Well, I think LeBron would probably win on that one. I don't know. But anyway, imagine this. Okay, so the presentation is we'll have a one-on-one fight, and whoever wins is going to be the winner of the day, and the other army will surrender. So they've got Goliath. And there's kind of a question of like, who can handle Goliath? I mean, you know what the Bible actually tells us is that King Saul was a pretty big guy. If I remember right, it says he stood a head over everyone else. So the obvious guy is King Saul. I mean, it seems to me that King Saul should be the dude that goes out there and challenges Goliath. But King Saul is not going out. And so this young boy, David, shows up, and he cannot stand it. He hears Goliath making fun of them, taunting God, and he says, I'm going to do something. And you know what I'd love to know is what David thought was actually going to happen. He seems so confident. Seems like he thinks he actually can win. It makes you wonder, was he afraid, or he just seems to rush in there. And so he approaches Saul, you know the story. And finally, he goes out and he grabs some rocks from a brook. Now, this artist, this is a really tense situation to me because the artist put the brook, the little stream right there on the battlefield. I like to think that maybe David had a little bit of privacy because he's about to get skewered and he's just now getting so that one bothers me, but just you get the idea. It's a tense situation. So David slings the stone, he takes down the giant, and that is the victory, and then it ensues into a military victory. So you know all that, and I just tell you that to kind of set up the amazing victory, the amazing heroism that David has just demonstrated, and honestly some of the cowardice that Saul has demonstrated in this. Now notice what happens right after this. It says, and this is 1 Samuel 18. When David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. Okay, so let's just kind of set this up. So after a victory, what would normally happen is the king would lead kind of a parade, just kind of let everybody know that, hey, we did a good job, we won, we have victory. And so Saul, it seems, is kind of leading this processional. And the women, it says the women come out singing songs. Now, for you ladies, men kind of are competitive on what women think of them. And so there's lots of men that have done a lot of crazy things because they wanted women to think highly of them. And so this is a tense situation just to start with. Okay, so the women, this verse is interesting because it says the women come out to meet Saul. Okay, so Saul's thinking, oh yeah, look, I got some fans. I'm a popular guy. But notice what happens right after this. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands. And if Saul had the song end, he would end it right there, but that's not where the song ends. David, his 10,000. We got trouble. So Saul is already a little bit of an insecure guy, it seems like, from the stories. And so what we have here is the king is being sort of moderately patted on the back, but David is getting this incredible accolade. And notice what it says that Saul felt about this. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, okay, so let's just, before we see what he said, so he's angry, it displeased him. That feels like kind of the understatement of the century, right? He was displeased because what he's going to do about this is actually pretty intense. So, this is Saul talking. He says, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. This sounds a lot like my kids, actually, that he has that toy and I wanted this toy. And I mean, it feels like such a petty sort of bickering. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Now Saul didn't know this, but this was kind of prophetic, really. I mean, David was going to be the next in line, and Saul is feeling that the popularity is going to David. Now here's the thing Saul couldn't seem to see, that it was because of Saul's actions that got him into this situation. I mean, Saul could have said, you know what? Nobody stands against the armies of God. He could have gone out there with his sword, and God probably would have blessed it. But instead, he played the coward's card. And so now David is getting the recognition for trusting God in this situation, but Saul doesn't see it that way. Saul seems to see it like, I deserve this, but David's getting it. David's getting the recognition that the king ought to get. So Saul eyed David from that day forward. You ever have an employer eye you? Keep there. You ever had somebody say, I'm going to keep my eye on you? Sort of what we see with Saul here. He eyed him, which is a funny word, but basically what it means is he's watching him. He's looking for him to trip up. He's trying to figure out how to maneuver in this situation where David would maybe take a fall. And so it seems like what it's getting at is Saul is now looking for a way to trip up David. And now here's one of the other problems with comparison, is that when we get into this envious mindset, we begin to hope for bad things to happen to those that we're comparing ourselves against. I heard one pastor say that we don't like to admit it because we're Christians, but if I've got kids in school and you got kids in school and you tell me that your kid failed, I'll say on the phone, oh, that's too bad. But by myself, I'm going, yes, my kid is doing better. I mean, we compare in a really just dark kind of way, and we don't want to admit that we do that. But I often kind of take pride in other people's failures, especially, I'll say, when I played music a lot. This was a thing that happened among musicians. If somebody hit a clunker note, and I was a musician and maybe they're opening for us, I'd be, yeah, that's right. Now they're going to know how good I am. I mean, it happens for artists. It's a common thing for artists. It's a common thing for any industry where there's skills that you have to have. We always kind of take a little bit of pride when someone else fails and we succeed. And here, Saul is kind of on the other side of it. He's feeling that. So Saul eyed David from that day forward. Here's Saul sort of just brooding, kind of upset. So it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul. Now this is a really tough verse, and I wanted to leave it in there just because I don't want it to be like we're just leaving things out. But this is a tough verse because some people have taken this and say, well, really it was God that forced him to do this stuff. We shouldn't read it that way. And I'll tell you why. We have other examples of this where someone decides the path they're going to go, and God just sort of quickens their pace along. Think of Pharaoh, for instance. Now, a lot of people will complain that, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Read the sequence in the story. It tells us that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then after that point, it tells us that God hardened his heart. So God was not forcing Pharaoh to do anything that Pharaoh hadn't already decided to do. All God was doing was quickening the pace, because God has a plan. And so it was almost a foredrawn conclusion of what was going to happen, but God hardened his heart further. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Another example is in the first couple of chapters of Romans, where it talks about that God will let people go if they are bent on following a depraved path, that He'll sort of let them go to the consequences of their sin. And what we got to remember here is Saul is already beginning to trip. Saul is already beginning to pursue envy. He's beginning to pursue a really dark path. And so what we find here is God is not making Saul do anything Saul hasn't already decided to do. But it does seem that he's trying to quicken the pace. Notice this verse that I think applies to this, because this is kind of what's going on inside of Saul. Envy is rottenness to the bones. Oh, that's sick. Envy is rottenness to the bones. Next time you feel envy, or I feel envy, here's the image I want us to have. It's rotting us from the inside. It's corrosive. It's toxic. And it eats you up. Envy is rottenness to the bones. Envy is dangerous. It's dirty. It's bad. Let's jump back to the story. So it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul. So David played music with his hand as at other times. Now here's the interesting thing. David doesn't seem to play into the character that is expected. Seems like Saul is feeling this tension, but David insists on just doing his job, trying to soothe and help the king. He doesn't say, oh yeah, we are at odds and I'm going to fight against you. I'm going to raise a coup. David doesn't do that. David does his job, he keeps his head down, and he tries to actually help. He tries to make things better with Saul by playing music for him. David would often play music to try to soothe the king. Now here's Saul and David, and I like this picture because it's as if Saul is back here brooding behind David's back. But there was a spear in Saul's hand. I emailed out this week that we were going to be talking about this, and somebody, I don't actually remember who it was, but somebody had a good comment. They said, the lesson here is don't perform for an audience with spears in their hands. I was like, yeah, that's pretty good. If you're performing, take it easy if they've got spears. So Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. Now, what's interesting here is he's throwing a spear at the guy that just killed the biggest man in the country. I mean, this guy is going to be difficult to kill, as you can imagine. So he throws this spear and he misses, or maybe David rolls, sort of like in the movies where you have like a commando that rolls and then, he gets out of the way. I don't know how he does it. And notice this, it says, but David escaped his presence twice. So Saul is losing it. I mean, he is losing it. He doesn't try to kill him just once. He tries to spear him twice. Remember, envy is rottenness to the bones. I mean, Saul is being eaten up by this envy. And it seems that he has no way to fight against it in himself. Now, Saul was afraid of David. This is sort of the bottom line of this story. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Now, by the way, we know from the story that both David and Saul were believers. So this isn't talking about losing salvation or something like that. What this is talking about is kind of what we talked about a moment ago. That God resists the proud, but He'll humble those. I said that wrong. Yeah, He gives grace to thank you. He gives grace to those that are humble. I was thinking, He's going to humble those that are humble? That doesn't quite make sense. So He gives grace to those who are humble, and that's what we see through this story. David is humble. David plays his part. He does what he's supposed to. And it seems that God has begun to bless what David is doing, and He's begun to resist what Saul is doing. Not arbitrarily, but because Saul has chosen this path that is becoming increasingly dark. Now here's a really great lesson that can help us kind of just decipher all this. In Galatians, Paul says the works of the flesh are evident. And then in the list he gives, he mentions envy. So here's just kind of the way to sort this out. If you ever feel envy, you don't have to ask this question. You don't have to say, is this emotion from the Lord? Is this emotion from the Holy Spirit? No. What Paul says is that emotion, a lot of times it's more than an emotion, it's even scheming and planning and being jealous. That is of the flesh. And so anytime we feel that, we can trust that it is part of our sin nature, and we need to fight against it. We need to fight to get rid of it. So this incredibly affected Saul's life. And in sort of the opposite way, it affected that Pharisee that we saw as well. And so, there's no win in comparison. There's nothing to be gained, but a lot to be lost. Now, I should say that I haven't really given you any answers. We've sort of set up the problem. And so, I'm not going to tell you what to do about it right now. Instead, I'm going to wait till next week because I want us all to come back and to think about this some more. And by the way, if you're interested in discussing this online, jump on the Facebook page because I think we're going to have some interesting discussion this week, just kind of thinking through this, maybe sharing some stories of how this has affected us. I bet every single one of us has a personal story about how comparison has hurt us and hurt others. So, come back next week for that. Let's pray.